Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Carrie Tully. I am honored and just thrilled to be here with everybody. We are here for the Decolonizing Economic Summit 2024, Earth Day to May Day. This is the Traditional Ecological Knowledge and Decolonizing Restoration panel. We've got a really great crew here to talk with you all about the work that they're doing, how it relates to traditional ecological knowledge and decolonizing restoration, and how that works in with the summit. Just to give you a little bit of a background on myself and how like I randomly came here. I Wow, where do I actually start? I am from the East Coast. I grew up right outside of Boston. I am of mixed European and Ashkenazi descent. I moved to California about, I think, almost 17 years ago, and kind of like meandered my way up from the Bay Area to Humboldt County, where I met some of the amazing, incredible organizers of this entire symposium or summit, I should say. And so was just so fortunate to be asked to help out and have been, just so proud to be able to contribute in any way, shape, or form that I can. I currently am the director of fundraising and engagement with the Civil Liberties Defense Center. I've been there about a month and a half, I think. Crazy how fast time has been going on or going by. And previously was the director of Dishgama Humboldt Community Land Trust with the Wiyat tribe. And previously before that was with Save California Salmon for about 3 years. And so really my background kind of is very social, environmental justice focused, and have become integrated into the community of people, many of the people that you've seen presented already throughout the last day and a half, and some of the people on this panel today. And so I'm just so thrilled to introduce the others on our panel. And I'm just going to quickly check to make sure and see if we have. I know that there's one person that might show up in just a bit. And so I'll introduce first Mel Figueroa, who is with California Open Lands. And we have Phil Albers with Save California Salmon. And so I'm going to let them both introduce themselves and talk a little bit about the work that they're involved with. And then kind of we'll just start an organic conversation and see where it leads us. So without further ado, Mel, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Sure. Hi, my name is Mel Figueroa. I am the conservation director for California Open Lands. I have been working in Butte County in Chico, California with Allie Metters Knight, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. She's the executive director of California Open Lands. She's a Mechoopda tribal member, basket weaver, and a traditional ecological knowledge practitioner. I've been working with her since 2019 for to put traditional ecological knowledge on the table and in the conversation when it comes to restoration. We do TEK certifications for workforce development. So we train workforces to be able to steward land in the appropriate way. Every and just also generally educating the community more widely in what traditional ecological knowledge is, which is the place-based science of indigenous peoples that has been developed over thousands of years in each specific place. So we work with local practitioners. We work with folks who are willing to learn from those local practitioners, and we pursue contracts for restoration for land. And as California Open Lands is a conservation land trust, we also hold various conservation easements and preserves that we're now kind of like kind of switching the model from the kind of very John Muir leave it alone type of conservation to one that integrates indigenous knowledge and people back into the environment. Before that, I was a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, also studying traditional agroforestry and working with traditional communities in Latin America, in the Amazon rainforest, as well as in the Midwest and in other places. So I'm a geographer by training. And so, but my mission has always been to uplift and valorize the immense, immeasurable wealth of knowledge, as well as the right of indigenous people to have land back. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that like little kind of snippet and your history as well. It's so, I just find myself so fascinated with like hearing the backgrounds and how people have come to like where we currently are. And so that was really nice to share. Thank you so much. And Phil, I'll pass it over to you.
Chimi, Aiki, Nanasui, Phil Albers, Nakadukwa Arar, Panam Niktenikri, Nithi Nati Peace Pachitichis, much Ihan Sasi Karulusi, Karuda Paniniki Awichwa, Save California Salmon. I am the education director for Save California Salmon, and I live in Orleans. I'm a Cuddick person and a fluent language speaker and teacher. Um, I worked for the Cuddick tribe for probably, geez, off and on through different programs and projects, the last like 20 years. Uh, but most recently, I was the cultural activities coordinator for the TANF program before coming over to Save California Salmon. So I spent the last 10 plus years specifically working on integrating TEK and cultural practices and knowledge into daily life in modern society. And that fits very well with Save California Salmon and the emphasis on understanding the importance of water and environmental justice and really bringing forward that, specifically, as mentioned, the science component to why indigenous peoples have practiced certain things the way that they did, ultimately why they lived the way that they lived, and how we can revitalize that in today's society while also being adaptable and being able to be successful in today's um, society and modern times. So that's a little bit of my background. And as for today, I really want to address TEK and what that actually means and how that actually looks in place in different places in an education system like California public school systems, or in a wellness and more of a social work atmosphere. So hopefully we can have some stimulating conversation on that.
I'm glad you brought that up actually, because one of the things that as a non-native person who has worked with um, multiple native communities and allies throughout the last however many years, and coming to like touch the outsides of like what TEK really means, um, like a huge component on so many different levels is the education aspect intergenerationally, um, and like the fact that that has been the way that the knowledge has been developed intercommunally, intertribally, like and there's so many different nuances depending on where and who and all of that, um but like the however many hundreds of years since colonization, depending on where you're at in the country, that chunk of time that's really been cut off from that intergenerational learning. And so now, like the things that both of your organizations and you are doing and working on in order to bring that back around, and not just for like native people, it's happening and taking place to educate all people. And so if you want to talk a little bit about that and like the work and how that kind of works into the past and present, that would be incredible.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that that's a great start to this discussion we can have. So, um, from my understanding and what I've been working with my colleagues and the organization with Save California Salmon, along with the state of California and the Humboldt County Office of Education, TEK goes beyond the simple materials or the I guess you could say like the Native American stuff. TEK is not bound to those things. They're not bound to an item or a ceremony. And when we talk about using TEK for whatever project or life way that you're trying to live, it becomes more of a mindset and um, an understanding of how to coexist with your environment. In a traditional sense, that was relatively easy because the technology obviously was completely different, and even the things that we did as indigenous people, um, we didn't have to fly anywhere. We didn't have to get in our cars and drive an hour or more to work for 8 hours and then drive home. Um, and the primary goal at that time, and I don't like to be too general or try to act like I'm speaking for all indigenous people. That's not what I'm trying to do, but I feel like it's pretty safe to say the ultimate goal is survival, right? It's continuance of the people, and that includes the individual and the community. And without that concept being a core foundation for these communities, lives would be so much more difficult and challenging. Um, and they already were, and they already are. But this in today's society, you can live in an apartment complex with 50 other residents and never know any of them, or even talk to your neighbor, uh, and you can get by that way, where that wasn't the case in a traditional context. That would have been an extremely difficult and dangerous way to live. So just that core foundation of understanding the health of your community is also the health of your family and ultimately yourself. And I think that concept has really been separated, even torn apart from the communities indigenous to this area, um, but also throughout the whole world. I mean, that's a battle in this concept of um, colonialism. I think that's one of the biggest struggles that people are facing is getting all the way down back to the very core foundation of how people can exist and survive and continue on into the future. Um, so I think maybe if you wanted to add something, Mel.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, just to, go off of what you say, when Allie and I talk about TEK, and Allie talks about it to other natives and others, we didn't call it TEK, it's like, of course not, because TEK is kind of a term for the white people to understand what life is, to indigenous folks. And I am not native to this continent. My family and my ancestors are from the Eastern Visayas Islands of the Philippines, but grew up traditionally, and I had a little bit of that. So you know um like it's recognizing that it's just a way of life. It's what life is. It's what it means to be human, is to coexist, in a community with all living things, including water, rocks, the idea that all of these things have sentience, and even fire does too, right? And that, you know it but thinking about it as a scientific methodology, there's a couple of things I want to say. First off, I do think California is a very interesting place to talk about these things, because the Western science doesn't even know what they don't know about California. A lot of times, when people are growing up in schools or whatever, they kind of gets portrayed like time began in 1850 when the gold rush people came, and then California began. And of course, that's not true. Like, obviously, like, I grew up going on like, well, like, what about like the, hundreds of thousands of years before that, right? The first systematic scientific survey of California ecology was in 1895. That's 45 years after the gold rush destroyed almost everything, and so that's the first thing I think, as a non-native, to kind of come in and understand, especially about a place like California, but also about other places that have been colonized, is that, a lot of what people think is natural is actually a post-apocalyptic landscape. The ecological apocalypse happened in California 180 years ago. And we are so thankful, and I have so much gratitude that the genocide was not successful, that people like you, Phil, and Allie, and all of these folks who's less than two grandmothers away from you know the way that life was, that can still remember. And that I think is a huge, so even if you're a scientist kind of coming in to try to understand things quote unquote scientifically, which is also going to be an interesting term that we're gonna kind of sort of demystify and decolonize, I think, hopefully here, is that there's the idea of having that tenure on the land, having that methodology and that intergenerational knowledge, that just isn't possible to work within a Western scientific data set. So one thing is just not knowing what you don't know, and knowing that there are people who do know. That's one thing. I think the second thing is yeah, TEK is also not something you can learn in a book. There's no textbook, TEK textbook that you can learn. A lot of what I have learned, from Allie and from other TEK practitioners throughout Northern California, is that, TEK is something you learn on the land. Because even sort of progressive understandings of, say, permaculture, or um, you know, gardening, regenerative gardening, or whatever, still takes a kind of human centric view. Even you can be in permaculture stuff, but people are still trying to control things, trying to control what plants do, trying to get productivity for humans above all else. And one of the things that I have learned in my time in the field and with these communities have been that, and all the plant communities also, is that, is really understanding very deeply, having a relationship with a place, a specific place. So, one of our community projects is Verbena Fields. It's a public park in Chico. And since 2019, the community has been out there. We've had weekly community tending days. So the community comes in and visits the same place every week, visits their favorite plant friends, visits the friends that that they have become to begun to have a relationship with for food, fiber, and medicine. And understanding that when that plants have co-evolved with humans, and that some of these plants that you'll the Western scientific world will think of, oh, you just need to like preserve it and like put it in a little like cage over here. They don't understand that they behave differently. So like things like deer grass, things like rhodeas, they behave differently when they interact with humans, and they behave differently when they interact with other species too, like bees and other plants as well. I've seen plants wait to bloom, right? Until it's time, or something is needed for a pollinator. So it is like sort of understanding less about the thingness of an ecology, and more about the relationships that make that ecology work, and understanding that everything has its own mind and its own sentience, just like other human beings, and that we can be in a relationship with that. That's a thing that is very, very different from, say, a TEK methodology as opposed to a Western scientific one.
I love all of that. Oh my gosh. And you guys are bringing up like similar things in your conversation. And so I really wanted to kind of take it back a little bit to be like, oh, wait, we should talk about some of the projects you're engaged with, which you've already started to do, Mel. But like, I feel like because TEK is all about connection, right? Like, what are the connections that you personally or your organization or like the work is? What are like focus on the connection that you have with like special places where you get to engage with this kind of work? Talk about that relationship, like what's special about that relationship. I want to hear like there's so many things that both of y'all are working on that I'm not allowed to say bad words right now, but like I'm really excited about it. And so I really want to hear and like allow you to share with everybody here kind of what's going on.
Yeah, great, thank you. One of the biggest movements and efforts that Save California Salmon has made is the Klamath River dam removal. And that's been a massive project. Um, Clearly, that wasn't one specific group or organization or individual on that project. And that is a really, in my opinion, a really good example of um, the type of persistence and consistent, dedicated effort through multiple generations on how to achieve something that for many people, even still today, are under the misconception that it is not beneficial. Um, it doesn't make any money to take the dams down. And then so when people can't fall back on the money point, which unfortunately most of what society revolves around today, um, sometimes they're confused. Um, Anyways, I don't want to get all into that down that road, but ultimately, most of these people, and of course, most of the indigenous people, believe that TEK was a major component in helping this actually happen. And it was hard to do because right now you can't. It's just like you can't find TEK in a textbook and there's not some specific pamphlet or handout or website that can just tell you everything you need to know about it. You can't really get a degree in TEK. And even if you really try to, well, we're talking about ecology, and within ecology, we're talking about, let's decompartmentalize all of that because that's what TEK is. It's not compartmentalized and boxed up into these cute little categories that we can dissect and place wherever we want. Um, that's not how it works. And in that battle for dam removal, all of those components had to be brought forth and somehow demonstrated in a Western based system. And most of you know, but there's not a true or accurate quantification system for TEK or for community wellness in terms of indigenous and cultural practices or methods or concept or theory. There's no way to actually quantify that. So that's a big challenge. And then when you have that part where it's hard for you to show on paper what these efforts are doing and how they're impacting people, um, it's really challenging. And I think that's one of the biggest problems. But what happened with the dam removal is so many people from so many different angles stepped forward, made their efforts, um, remained dedicated. And that goes all the way from people on the law end going into meetings with their suits and notebooks or laptops and looking at legalities and looking at financial components and that side of the process, all the way to the people that were living on the river that continued to hold the importance of the salmon and the river ecosystem, that habitat and that relationship, and passing that on to their children or to their friends and families or even new community members that came in at a different time, and really reinforcing on the ground how important that it all was. And I think that that's a great example of one of the successes and what can happen. And um, I know there's a lot of protests and activism going on um, all different fronts. I mean, but the dam removal one was multi-generational effort, and um, I think that's a pretty good example of some of the work. And so part of what I'm doing is with education is trying to bring some of those points out. And it wasn't just the picket line, or it wasn't just the camp out on the courthouse or the state capitol lawn, or it wasn't just the people going in and having attorneys and having legal personnel go through these documents and lay all this stuff out. It was all of those things all combined.
Thank you for that. We've all been so thrilled to see the dams come down and the river run free, and knowing how much of an effort that is. That's so wonderful to see and to hear. And like you said, it takes all kinds, of folks. It sometimes takes people who have to kind of navigate both worlds. Um, I said, as a non-native, but someone who studied TEK, I feel like, sometimes like my job is to kind of translate, so like the knowledge that Ali has and the knowledge that these practitioners have, to be able to translate that to agencies and to the colonial world in a way that they will accept. And it is a challenge. A lot of times, sometimes we work on things like fire restoration or reforestation projects, and then we get these templates that like just want to put timber trees back, or want to plant them all close together because that's from the legacy of forestry. And I mean, forestry in this country doesn't actually mean taking care of forests. Really, it means tree agriculture. Let's be real. And that's a very colonial way of, extracting the resources. So how do we take these templates and bust them open and change them to, know what we actually want as a healthy forest, and a forest that is full of plants that people interact with all the time. So, there's so many assumptions, I think, that the colonial world makes, that has to be broken down. And that's what we do in our advocacy work a lot. Things like wilderness. In many native languages, including my own, there is no word for wild. Right? There's no wilderness, because everything was home and people were taking care of it. So there are things like the Forest Service policies on wilderness that prevent traditional practices like cultural fire and other things to be put on it. So these are like understandings, and that we need to come to with the wider world, to be able to break down those barriers as well. In our own work in restoration, and we've done riparian restoration work, salmon side channel restorations, different types of work, a lot of it in waterways and in riparian areas. And then this is another sort of environmental history note that we have to take into account, is the replumbing of California's waterways through dams, through the California aqueduct and other things, to extract the water resources for agriculture, for conventional agriculture. And how that also has contributed to the wildfire problems in the Northern California region, as well as droughts and all of those things. And with climate change, one of the things we also talk about are the periodic floods that come through. Floods that, I don't think any dam will be able to hold after a while, right? So sort of the inevitability of the reset, of the coming back of the water, and understanding, like, why wetlands are important as well for that. Wetlands are important for so many things. And the people who engineer them, and the people who engineer our cities, and developers who are like, oh well, we'll have to just set this wetland aside before I don't know what reason. It's like, well, where do you think your water comes from? you know so there's a lot of things like that, that doing our work, we've been able to kind of like break through a lot of the very common assumptions about the importance of water, the importance of salmon, the importance of different keystone species. Ali is a basket weaver, so a lot of what she teaches us around TEK has to do with basketry and the availability of good willow for baskets. And as a riparian ecologist, I've come to understand, like, it takes a whole ecosystem to make a basket. And when you have basket weavers that are tending that willow for their materials and for the health of the willow, the whole the whole waterway can benefit from that. Thinking about beavers, studying about hopefully bringing beavers back. I think that's a would be an awesome thing. But in the meantime, what can we do to help be the beaver and to help to slow and sink and spread that water? So as we've been working in Verbena Fields, we've been able to bring back that kind of braided, meandering stream that I've only seen in textbooks before. I never really seen in California proper before, because the creeks and the waterways have been altered so much by colonization and gold mining. So being able to see those things really come to life with not just and with no mechanized equipment either. A lot of people like to bring in the bulldozers and the thing with the special fuel that costs like $100 a gallon. We've been able to do with hands and with the community. That's another thing. Western science is a very specialized, elitist type of science. But TEK is a way of life. Everybody had to do it, from the children to the elders. And, in order to do that, it has to be understood by everyone, so that everyone who lives on any land, any part, any place, anybody who takes care of any place needs to understand what that place needs, you know? And so, a lot of times another kind of um, component that we've been able to change in restoration is also like using seed banking and using lands that we have access to, whether it's a conservation easement or a public park, or just an area that people let us go as living seed banks. So because California native species don't tend to do well in nurseries. We kind of call them, like, they're a little bit spoiled by like the special soil and the water and the irrigation drip. So when you actually put it in the ecosystem that it's supposed to go into, it's like, it's a um you have all these sheltered plants, and then they're in this ecosystem. They're like, I don't know, right? So in the industry, most restoration projects barely achieve a 30% survival rate. They're kind of lucky to do so, because commercial nursery operations don't mimic and don't even think about the actual conditions where these plants are supposed to thrive in. So then you have all of these like kind of weird orchard plantings with irrigation and all of this stuff. And so our approach to TEK restoration is a little bit different. We actually use the land as living seed banks, and we pay attention to the DNA that has survived in those conditions, and selecting for those seeds, so that when we put those seeds into the ground, they have that adaptation already in them. And so we did a restoration project at East San Slough in Red Bluff for a salmon side channel, and got over a 70% survival rate even after a couple floods. Everybody thought our project was going to be wiped out, and the plants bounced back better than ever after a flood. And we're like, of course, we knew it was going to flood. We planned for that. Why did you plan for that? Right? So, there are I think there's like a kind of like techno-scientific bias in a lot of like sort of Western restoration with your hard hats and everything that isn't really necessary when you understand sort of, the principles and the methodology behind how a place can be restored. And California is a place of disaster. There's fires, there's floods, there's volcanoes, there's all kinds of things. And to understand that, these plants aren't as fragile as I think people think they are, just because they haven't been in the right context. And that context includes people. And ultimately, and I want to just lastly speak to Phil's point that, it's really hard to quantify in a Western scientific measurement the what a TEK thing does, right? Like from step to step to step to step. But where we're actually looking at is the outcome, because the land doesn't lie, you know? When at the end of the day, all of those numbers and all of those little statistics and all those little like check off things, um, you know, does the land look healthy? Is there biodiversity? Is there, species that, humans and wildlife and other littles rely on for food and fibers and medicines, are they there? Are we able to survive as a people through a lot of changes? That's, I think, the metric that we need to really be looking at as time goes on, especially with climate change, because ultimately that's what's going to matter. And the land won't lie to you, right? Numbers can lie, but the land will never lie.
I love that. That's so valid. As like a person who tries really hard to work with my own tiny little plot of land that I have, like you can try and plan and do all of these things that you're like supposed to do and follow the instructions and all of this stuff, but really at the end of the day, like what's actually happening? Like how are you going to respond to what's happening and like move with what's happening in order to get to where you need to be? And it's just an iterative process, which is, baby TEK happening right here. Learning with my little land that I'm trying to make the most out of and keep it as happy and healthy as I can. um and so both of you have talked about like these major restoration projects that are going on, which are just so exciting and incredible. And like the partnerships that it takes with non-native trained and like state organizations. And like if you can talk a little bit about, and Mel, you've already done a little bit of this, but I'd love to go even like deeper. Like, how is that relationship? Like, what does that look like in terms of like co-leadership or not? And like, what is this? I don't know how to frame it the right way, but like, how is this going to impact our future, our economy? Like, how can this work that you're doing and these massive projects um, improve us and support a just transition, economically and otherwise?
So, what Allie and I have been working on for the past, 5 years, and Allie's had this vision since, far before that, is really workforce development. Given that there has been a genocide and given that, indigenous peoples are a small part of the population, I mean, as non-natives, that's kind of gross too, to be like, okay, you guys can do our yard work now. Now that we messed it all up, oh, here, now you can fix it, right? It really does take a community effort, and it takes more of an acculturation to because everyone, I mean, we could be doing our TEK thing in one part of Chico, and then somebody else who doesn't, who has a big contract for another part of Chico will just go in and do their thing anyway, right? And so like, does that help the land, right? And so that's part of the first awareness that we're bringing to the wider community, is that TEK is something that everyone who lives on the land and touches the land need to at least know about and respect, right? To respect that there are things that we don't know, and that, there's maybe a different way to do things than herbiciding or mowing or whatever, right? So that's just number one. But number two is also, I mean, even as all these community projects are going through really big, there's these huge other projects that get left to giant corporations, Allie and I started. I joined Allie in her effort after the campfire, destroyed Paradise, California, which is just up the hill from where I'm here in Chico. And we tried. We actually had a intertribal workforce of like 50 folks trying to get in on the rest on the recovery contracts. And we what we found out was that, there are these like like very small number of huge corporations that basically follow FEMA around and get these contracts. And we had folks, when we had thousands and thousands of people who were homeless, they built this giant work camp to get people from New Jersey to come and put and take the trees out, the burned trees out, and start restoring the place. It's like, wait a minute, who the hell are these people and what do they know about this place? Nothing, right? So, Allie's concept of TEK certification sort of came into the mix at that point where, we saw that like these people have to have, forestry certifications, firefighting certification, all these different certifications to touch the land. Well, why not a TEK certification to know that you can properly touch the land and that you have spent time with indigenous people, you have spent time with a practitioner to at least understand what kind of tree you're looking at for, and or what kind of trees need to stay, what kind of trees need to go, or, at least some understanding from an indigenous perspective of how to work on the land. And so, we started to create crews of people. So, like our initial crew, and they couldn't get any. Contracting for TEK restoration didn't even really exist back then, and so they were kind of like a forestry crew cutting trees. But with TEK certification, they cut trees better than anybody else, and they could do meadow restorations in very sensitive areas and do things in culturally sensitive areas too to make sure that they weren't damaging mortars or other, traces. So, at the outset, right, even just having that TEK certification, which we don't really count as like, you do this thing in a book and you take a test or whatever. It's really like time spent with a practitioner, time spent trying to understand the way of life and how people use the landscape. It makes, even the regular jobs better. And then when we started to actually get contracts for using TEK in restoration, because that's what we found out was that like you can get a job on a contract, but that scope of work is already decided upon. So even if you had, like a native crew and a tribal crew, they still had to carry out the white man's work, right? And so that's when we started to fight even harder for like no, like indigenous people and TEK practitioners need to have input on the scope of work, the things that need to be done on the land. And then we finally started achieving that. And honestly, we're we've done a couple and now we're starting to get more of these. But it's been a long effort and a long struggle, but it's starting to open up. And so that's what I feel hopeful about is non-native people learning from native people, native led organizations and initiatives that non-native people can learn from and also work together, in respect and harmony. That I think will help to really achieve things, on the scale at which it needs to. But indigenous peoples of that particular place really need to be in the lead.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. That was great. And I'd just like to continue on with that in a slightly different perspective in terms of um, having an understanding of I guess you could say a pre-contact and a post-contact concept of work in general. Um, I'm not saying they're necessarily very different. If you say you're going to do something, you agree to what that compensation is, and then you do it. So that part is really not that much different um, from my experience and my teachings. But what is different is what that process looks like. Just like Mel said, we part of the important parts, and I think this might help answer Mary's question. Um, Everything's based around that concept of money, right? We need to get money to pay somebody to do this, and then when the people have that money, their goal most of the time is to keep it or make more of it. So that includes spending less of it when they need to, and they'll get different people to do it, right? That's pretty common and even understandable to a degree. Um, so reframing some of that process, because that ultimately that's what's dictating what happens on our lands. And in order for that to change, several things need to happen or continue progressing, because many of them are happening. But and it was mentioned inclusion, having a tribal perspective included in these conversations. in these discussions about how are we going to repair or revitalize or replenish or prevent. Prevention's a really big one that I don't think gets enough attention, but including that TEK component, that'll be a big help. And then none of that really, we've seen that, right? We got a seat at the table as indigenous people. There's now a consultation requirement for a lot of different processes for the state and federal governments, but that doesn't actually amount to accountability. And that's a big problem. That's a real issue. Well, we heard what you said. You presented, you shared this, you've given us these reports, you did these things we said we need, but we're not going to follow it anyway. And that's a real problem, which some of the work specifically, for example, Sume State Park, the name change and this co-management authority or process that they're establishing, and now National Park Service is doing that. That is really helping to start reframing some of that. So there is accountability. There is more than just, okay, come here, say what you want to say, and then we'll do whatever we want. Now there's actually a process being established, which I think is incredible. None of that can happen without actually acknowledging the importance of TEK. You can acknowledge that it exists, but if you can't accept the importance of it, it'll be really hard to incorporate it. So that's a really challenging issue all by itself there. And reframing that process. Now, when the dams came out, a lot of people were using the term the stars have aligned, which I thought was pretty cool, but also it wasn't referring specifically to people in place, to specific individuals in those places. That matters. That's critical. Educating indigenous people and educating people as indigenous people who accept indigenous TEK perspectives and then acknowledge that importance, that's critical. But it's the overall process that has to really reframe and change. And that's a really challenging thing when it comes down to money, because TEK, monetary wealth for most indigenous people wasn't the life goal. It wasn't your business's goal. There wasn't that process as predominantly. I'm not saying it didn't exist, of course, but it wasn't the main, it wasn't mainstream in that sense. So reframing some of that is how we can start addressing that, and that part is, it's still is a challenge. I mean, I don't really know how to explain that much more than that. So I hope that answered your question a little bit, from Harry. And it's just a lot to try to process and continue working on as indigenous people, because while we want to include these like as pure of a traditional concept as we can, we still have to realize that this is today. This is 2024. We have to understand and incorporate or adapt. And I like the word adoption, because adaptation, maybe that's the right word, more than the term of assimilate. And I think sometimes people confuse that. And that's one of the, personally, why I think people use the two world analogy, because the reality is there's only one world. I mean, in terms of physical, where we have to live in, there's just one. But defining that difference between, evolving and adapting to this environment and this society, that's different than assimilating. And that's where TEK has its most strong presence. That's the biggest difference. So, yeah, I hope that was helpful.
That is really helpful. Gosh, there's like so many things that are being said that I'm like, oh, I want to talk about that and I want to talk about that. It's, like California is such an interesting place to be in, because it's like we're so progressive and we're like, doing all these wonderful and incredible things. Yeah, like yes, that's true in comparison to other places. And at the same time, it's like it's just not enough, you know, like we have like, you know, all of these statements of administration policy and executive orders that have been passed that say like that we are like state agencies are required to work well with tribes, that we need to be considering like consultation and collaboration with tribes every step of the way for any decision that's making it like that's taking place on their lands. Like, yes, I'm glad you said those words. Now, where's the follow up and where's the action? Because straight up words are on a page are just not enough. Like, there's no like slap. Are we getting slapped on the wrist? Are we getting fined? Like, what's going on when those things aren't happening? And what are the repercussions? Because at that point, at this point, it's like climate change is um like rapidly progressing in ways that is so blatantly obvious that like I'm scared to talk with my child about it because it's like terrifying me. Um and so like what are we really doing here when we fight about who's going to get the biggest contract, when we fight about how much money this person's going to get paid for this thing? And it's like, hold on a second. Can we rewind and remember that we're trying to like to bring it back to what we started with, to survive? Like this is about us surviving. And unless you like take the time to get to know the land, to get to know each and every individual species, like we're not gonna be okay. We can't just like put up a structure or do, you know, anonymous like alternative energy projects B and like call it a day and be like, we did it, we're good. Um, so that's kind of like a rant. Like I don't know if I'm going anywhere with that. And you know, of course, like all of these alternative energy projects that are coming up and like taking place, and there's all these things happening with them. They are important as well. They're like, you know, workforce development and trying to like save us from this dire emergency. And not it's not just the answer. It's like we're taking giant strides, but we're not taking as many giant strides as we, at least to me, it seems that we absolutely need. Um, yeah. So if you have any follow up to that, but also like immediate needs, like do you feel like there are immediate needs that like things that like our government are the supposed leaders of our state, country, um like should be really honing in on? um yeah, I guess that's kind of a question.
Yeah, I mean, there's always that. What could happen right now? Well, um, releasing and understanding the difference between um, TEK as a knowledge, as a concept is important, but along with that, supporting that it has to be on the ground, that it has to be with the people of the community. And I'm not specifically saying it needs to be only indigenous people of that community. I mean, this is 2024. We do need to address the fact that, you know, a certain area might have 1 million residents, which was extremely uncommon specifically in North America that I've ever heard. Um, and so immediately it would be, and it comes down to that, the money. Start putting um, restrictions or requirements or taxation or support, allowing people and organizations who are doing TEK based work in whatever field, allowing them to access those resources and to pool some of that financial support. Because a lot of, and this is an issue most of organizations that I know and work with, if you can't quantify your TEK, you can't use it as a basis for a project to receive grant funding, state funding, federal funding. You know, having a cultural wellness, or part of what I did in my previous job and what I've been working with um, lately is understanding what therapy is, right? You can't be a therapist without having a certification. You can't provide therapy without being a therapist, which is clearly defined and compartmentalized, nice and pretty, so you can prove that and then get paid or have access to that specific resource. Um, but a lot of the cultural practitioners and the people who can do cultural wellness and do mental and emotional um, activities, facilitate them successfully, and have successful positive results, aren't certified therapists. And that could be for whatever reason. The reason is irrelevant, um, mostly, but for me to have a family and say, these are the needs of this family, and I can do a bow making project that could take 8 to 10 weeks for these two boys. And I can lay all that out, but there's no evidence proving how successful that's going to be. And if I want to demonstrate that, I have to pick something to prove that it's successful. Your school grades, you're not in detention anymore, behavioral issues within a school system, or you're getting your job, or you're keeping your job, or you're stopping drugs, or all these different boxes I got to try to check and fill. And that is a real challenge. Um, not because it's hard to prove that. That's not the primary issue. The primary issue is I shouldn't have to in order to access these resources. I didn't have to, or our people didn't have to 500 years ago. If you knew, if you're in a family and you notice your son and his cousin, who all happen to live in the same house, are having bad behavior, they get they might get sent off to their uncle or their grandpa, or there would be a process for that. And they didn't say, if you do this, I'll pay you this much money, but you have to make sure this and this and this happen. And of course, that's within family, but there was a process for those things. There was a process lined out for that, for male and female, and um, there were a process for all of that that didn't have to be quantified. And so that, as far as addressing that in terms of immediately, I think that would be one of the biggest needs. And however that needs to happen, if people have ideas or they're already working on something like that, reach out to me anytime. I'll be happy to contribute or be a part of that discussion. Um, that's the first thing I can think of.
Yeah, that's a tension, especially like if you're doing contracts or you're going for a grant, is, a lot of times, and I'm sure like and a lot of folks, especially when you're dealing with universities or other types of systems, so people are trying to steal knowledge, and being able to keep that knowledge sovereignty while being able to say, okay, we can do these deliverables that can be quantified. It's a dance. It's a very tricky dance, right? There were things like grants that we applied to that, where they or contracts that we're trying to do when the biologist was like, well, tell us all of your secrets. I was like, no, we're not. No, that is not going to happen. And it's gotten better over time, and the more that we've advocated, the more that we've, pushed to be able to say, okay, we had a meeting with cultural practitioners and we discuss cultural stuff, and that's all you need to know. you know so being able to like retain the knowledge sovereignty while being able to say, okay, well, we will tell you what you need to know because you care about ecology, number of species, etc. Okay, we'll do all that. So part of what I do is like monitoring, right? So I know I have a set of parameters that I need to tell the agency. And so we can do that. We don't have to tell the agency everything that we're doing. For that, you're going to have to come to a workshop, you know, and learn it from and spend time again, like spend your energy and your time, to learn from an indigenous person. But so that's one way we've been kind of trying to navigate being able to retain that knowledge sovereignty, The other thing is like, okay, if you have this project that you want to integrate TEK into, well, that's why we have this workforce development. We have a crew, you know. Um, like instead of, again, somebody taking and extracting knowledge from a practitioner and then like going and hiring somebody else to do it that doesn't even know, right? Well, it's about, the people, there are people that are, spending time with practitioners that are getting trained. And, and these are the people or tribes even, now we're supporting tribes to develop their own crews, right? So that when because that's what you need to do when you go for a state and federal contract is you need to be able to show capacity, right? You need to be able to show something to them to tell them that you can do it. And so having, a workforce training and having a tribal crew that, has spent time with practitioners and all of that can show, and that keeps the benefits of that contract and that money within the community as opposed to just extracting the knowledge and taking it somewhere else, right? The other thing, I think that's important to mention here, if an agency is dealing with tribal engagement, is that, oftentimes, not all the time, of course, but oftentimes, the tribal government representatives are not the practitioners, right? And so, sometimes there when people want to send those letters, and then they're like, oh, they deal with a tribal government or a staff person who's not necessarily the TEK practitioner. Those wires can be crossed sometimes. So, I mean. I'm not. It's not my place to comment on tribal politics, but it is also just an awareness that practitioners are often are often community members, and that when it comes to the living cultural resources and stuff, it's important to listen if a practitioner is saying something, right, that who is not necessarily. And I don't know how that works out. Again, it's like, it's not my place to comment on tribal politics, but in terms of agencies as well, I've seen people get in trouble because an agency will talk to a practitioner and then call it the tribe when they're not representing the tribe. So there's a lot of things that, agencies are starting to learn, and we're sort of helping to educate about, you know, um what that means in terms of like getting TEK or and in tribal engagement. And it's very possible to be able to work with the community and and with and within and between tribal governments as well. In terms of the resilience question, that's where I think, um as a nonprofit, we've been able to engage with different tribes and support them, like I said, in developing their own crews and being able to engage with different practitioners and connecting different practitioners together, which has been really exciting because one of the things that we pay attention to when we're looking at climate resilience especially is trade routes and traditional trade routes, and how tribes worked together in the past to provide refuges for one another, to be able to plant that food, fiber, and medicine along the trail, so that people who did travel in between places were supported. And that's an important concept when we're talking about resilience and we're talking about, different communities being affected in different ways, or communities that have been displaced, right? And are given, reservation land on a place that's got a super fund or some other kind of like um environmental hazard. It's important to also be able to make those connections on the community level, so that we can all work together, as these impacts deepen. um and yeah, another thing too is the funding part. Again, like we've been trying to sort of like take over the system, or try to use it in ways that ultimately serve the ends of being able to reestablish gathering grounds for people to be able to give indigenous communities access, as a form of land back. Land back isn't just a title in English law, you know. It is also that the land gets the people back, right? And so, you know, as a conservation organization, it's been very exciting to be able to work with different tribes and say, you know, hey, you know, there's this project in your territory, you know, like if you know work with us to restore it, and then you know that tribe has the gathering grounds back, you know, and access, having access, being able to negotiate, you know, access for communities to go back into places that they haven't been allowed back into for generations, you know. And that becoming a resource, not just for money but for food, fiber, and medicine. But it does take money to restore these places. It does take money to be able to, like, you know, bring people in a way that is dedicated enough that it is more, it becomes more than just like the Native American thing, but it becomes, you know, something that can be a livelihood for Native people and for, you know, underserved communities and local communities that are, you know, in solidarity with the local tribe. And so, you know, and that's an issue too. I know that, you know, there's a lot of conversations happening in the nonprofit world and in the agency world about, you know, like if we're going to have capacity and we don't have capacity to begin with, why do we have this reimbursable grant? You know, where we have to do all the money, we have to do all the work up front, and then like we have to wait months and months to get reimbursed, you know. So there's things within the funding streams that can be modified, knowing that these are like low income people. We're all paycheck people, paycheck to paycheck people, trying to do something new, right? TEK is something new. And you know, on one level it's great that some of the agencies are listening and changing practices, but that needs to deepen.
I 100% hear you. Yeah, I think like the whole funding like aspect of getting this work done, like it is changing slowly. Having worked, you know, on state specific, like specifically state funded projects, um, you know, as a tribal employee, like, you know, there are things that are happening at the state level that are making um, it more accessible to get funding from the state, that are like tribal specific grants, or extended timelines, or less reporting, things like that. And at the same time, it's like that's all great. You're like moving in the right direction. That's like we see that you're like showing up to conversations and trying to listen to what tribes are saying that they need, or tribally led organizations. Um, and it's like the same thing. It's almost like it's just not really happening fast enough. And it's like those kinds of progressions need to really pick up the pace in order to make the funding more accessible. The barriers need to be dropped, because it's exactly right. Like these are paycheck to paycheck people. There's no capacity. Capacity needs to be developed in order to like get these projects rolled out. Um, and so it's like training the agencies, which, you know, again, like agencies seem to be relatively open to hearing what tribes and allies have to say. And that's also an extractive process, because you're taking time and energy and effort away from the people that are trying to get the money to do this important work and to change all of these policies. And it's just like, you know, it doesn't seem to end. And so the people that are doing this work, including both of yourselves, it's just a tireless like process. And just I have so much empathy, compassion, love for both of what y'all doing, and everybody who's in the crowd or listening in on KMUD. You know, it's such important work. So I like really praise you for your efforts. And kind of like to transition a little bit, um, and like on that kind of compassion tip, uh, and especially with like the political climate that we're facing, you know, including student occupations on campus, including protests, including mass arrests, including police violence, including genocide happening in Gaza. Um, and the upcoming election, which, like, who knows what's going to happen there, but either way, it's going to be kind of like a chaotic kerfluffle of so many different things. What I feel, and I think you'll both agree, is that the that like, we really need to like amp up, beef up our like connections with our community, with nature, with like our everything, any our people, our pets, our places, our food, just all of it. Like those connections need to deepen and expand, I think, in order to survive as a whole, this kind of next wave of humanity. And so, if you have any thoughts on that, like tactics that you use, ways that you feel the most connected to either your community or your places, um, what supports you lean into in times like this, things like that, that might be helpful for our listeners.
Yeah, that's one of my areas of expertise, in my personal opinion, mostly because that has a lot to do with exactly TEK and understanding that connection. And then, like I said, in that same process, not only do I acknowledge it, that it exists, and and the high, extremely high significance that holds for me and my family, um, we hold ourselves accountable to it, and that has to do with participation in specific ceremonies, um, and and I don't typically like to separate out religious belief from cultural practice very much. I do think there is a line, a separation there. Um, that's why I'm just addressing it. We making effort, dedicated effort to engage in both, for what our religious beliefs are, but also being a part of that cultural part and being part of that cultural component where we're able to be out in the land and we go through extended periods of time throughout the year, where we should shut down everything. We'll even turn off the power to our house, and if we're not out camping or out in the wilderness ourselves, because not everybody can do that, um, especially if you're in the cities or metropolitan areas. That's a real challenge. Um, but being able to just shut off the electricity or shut off the Wi-Fi's, unplug the phones, unplug the TVs, and just actually engage in that time with your family. We specifically call it basket time. That we refer to our family as a basket, um, and we do simple things like that. Um, but I really did like the conversation in the chat. I don't want to sidebar this whole thing, but I think it actually is connected where it does take that time. And the negative impacts, not just from colonization or mismanagement of the land, but that also goes into climate change and this simple natural process of physical life. I mean, to think that everything was always the same as it was 500 years ago, 500 years before that, 1,000 years before that, that's kind of ridiculous, um, and not really consistent with reality, in my opinion, uh, which can be verified through science, Western science, but as well as traditional ecological science. Um, that's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take a lot of effort, but like was mentioned in the chat, it requires access. It requires the freedom to go in, make those assessments as indigenous people, that you don't have to be bound to, oh, I have this environmental degree or I have this special certification that proves to you I'm an expert in this specific thing. Again, all these little compartmentalized pieces. Um, but being able to get into that land, get onto that land, look at it, understanding that if you really want to restore the land and work towards removing those toxins, there are natural processes in place within nature that will do that. And there are identified safe ways to help facilitate that or expedite it to an extent. But it's not going to happen just, oh, here, let's sprinkle some medicine on it. That's not how this um, process can happen, especially on huge lands. So I think that's part of it, being able to connect with that component and incorporate that into what you're doing as an individual, as a family member, and what that looks like for you. That's kind of your responsibility to work out. And of course, for me, while I was trying to learn those things, I had my grandmother who was a first language, full-blooded Kaduk tribal member, and then I had a lot of aunties and uncles. But then on my mom's side, I also had my grandparents who were able to help me do that, and they came from Oklahoma, and then they came over to California and didn't at all practice indigenous Native North American practices, and they, but that didn't have a negative impact on me. So that's your responsibility as an individual to seek that out for how you can learn that. And that's part of the TEK process, being able to be that independent free will, or work through that for yourself. But so that's what I had.
Yeah, honestly, I agree. Just real quick, there's nothing like being on the land that teaches you a lot of things, not just about the land, but also how to navigate other people, structures, how to keep calm and in different situations. Since going out to Verbena Fields every week, and we have a core of people, like of 10 or 20 people that that know the land, that love it, that come back every week, come when it rains, in the middle of the rain, to see how the creek is doing. Yeah, it's not something you can really like put into words, but it's an experience, and a repeated experience that gets integrated into people's ways of life, that just makes you see it differently, and helps you to approach everything differently, understanding the cycles of time, and that it takes time, and understanding that iterative process, changing a field from 6 foot high star thistle to 100 different species of flowers and potatoes and wild onions, and and herbs and medicine. It takes time, and it takes the collaboration. It's an effort. Those aren't values or methodologies or techniques that were ever taught in colonial capitalist society. It's a relearning, but it's also kind of like allowing the land to reteach you what you already know. We are all indigenous to somewhere. We are somewhere because the land, we all belong to some piece of land somewhere. And no matter where we're at, if I recognize myself as somebody like that, and I can recognize Phil and Carrie and every one of you as somebody like that, that helps me deal with people differently. you know if we understand that, that again, having access to land is not about owning it. It is about kind of having that relationship, and allowing for people to have that kind of relationship with a piece of land, week in, week out, year over year. It changes even our whole concept of private property differently, right? There's so many things that the land teaches us that we've forgotten to listen to, that once we start re-listening, it can just really revolutionize our way of life. And having those proof of concepts out there, having those opportunities, I think will be, it'll be transformative for a lot of people. And that's what I would like to be engaged in, is to be able to open up as many of those opportunities as possible.
That was beautiful, both of you. Thank you so much for that. I did want to like leave it open for a couple of questions if we have a minute, but also before we do that, if there are links that you want to share, if there are resources or like places you want people to go to check out, including donation pages, I totally, this is a great opportunity to do that. I know that you could put it into the, what is it called? The Padlet that was dropped earlier. I don't know if, Jack, if you could drop that link in again, if people want to put information in there so that it can be shared after the fact and people can check it out later. or directly into the chat works too. But any like final thoughts before we kind of jump in and maybe take a question or two from the crowd? I know that we're kind of coming up on time here.
I really want to say thank you to everybody, and I appreciate you taking the time to at least hear out what I'm trying to share and what my efforts are. By no means do I expect anybody to completely agree with what I say just because I say it. I encourage you to take it in and make it information. But as you progress in yourselves, really work to find and identify what you can take and become more than information and actually progress into knowledge, which goes from, information is something you can know and you can have, but knowledge is something that becomes a part of you and a part of who you are. That's my perspective on that. So, thank you all, and yeah.
I don't really have a like a set kind of sign off. I want to thank everyone for listening. I continue to listen and have solidarity with everyone out there, everyone who's trying to um reestablish a relationship with their place. Um, you know, uh like again, my life my mission in life has been to help to uplift the voices that aren't heard and to uplift these wisdoms that have been so very consciously dis I don't know, like dissed, I guess, or like put down by colonial capitalism. And we already know that it doesn't work. I mean, ecologically speaking, I feel like colonial capitalism's um, methods are quite primitive compared to what people have, all people all over the world have developed over thousands of years. There's an interesting question in the chat just now that just talked about, you know, um, what is it? Can a TEK practitioner translate their land listening language culture to other lands, or does it only work on the land of one's historical stewardship? Well, yes and no, because, if you think about it as place based, it's like, who am I going to ask? I'm not going to ask, somebody who's been there for 100 years. I'm going to ask somebody who's been there for 20,000 years, right? That kind of just makes a little bit more sense. But as I have found out from my own engagement with cultures that are not my own in this work, I've realized that in by engaging and really listening and learning from people here in California, I've come to actually understand my own culture a lot better. I feel like TEK is like we all speak different languages because we come from different places, but there's something about the grammar of the language that can be, that we can understand each other if we understand ourselves as people of our respective lands. And I think in that can come a common understanding. But if we're going to go work on a particular piece of land, absolutely you have to go to the local person. The person who you have to ask yourself, whose tribal territory are you in? Everywhere we are is native land. Everywhere we are is somebody's tribal territory. But if we know that and can come in a good way and with respect and understanding, there's something in that can help ourselves understand ourselves a little bit more. That's been my experience, and and something that we can share together.
Love it. You guys are amazing. We kind of don't really have time for a last question, so sorry about that, folks. But it has just really, truly been an honor to speak with you, Phil. I know that we get to work together a little bit, and we've done some things together in the past, and so it's really nice to have the opportunity to share this space and time with you. And Mel, it's been truly an honor and a pleasure to have this conversation with you as well. I'm so grateful for your time and all of the like wonderful experiences and knowledge that you've been able to share. Um, I don't have anything else that I need to say to sign off, except keep watching the summit, the next panels for the rest of the day and all tomorrow. I mean, all of them are incredible. If you haven't caught any already, then you've totally been missing out, and hopefully you'll get a recording. And
Yeah,
I
thank
don't know if
you.
there's any sort of administrative sign off that anybody needs to do from the summit crew, but thank you everybody for being here and sharing this afternoon with us.